some luck, some timing, some help, and my break that allowed me to become a photographer, a working photographer, and making a living photographing for magazines. I mean, that came in 1987.
Oh no, the timing was amazing. You were there during these pinnacle times for a lot of Asian cities. And their changes to their social and environmental foundations were so profound. Like, how do you think these changes really affect humanity? How did it affect you? And did you ever feel compromised in let's say, in your career positioning as a photojournalist?
Well, my photojournalism phase, was kind of in the middle of everything. I made pictures as a young person for many, many years before anything would ever get seen.
Mm.
And much of it still hasn't really. Pre-internet, there was no way to share anything or show anything. So that was the beginning of my picture making, was in the 70s and 80s, in traveling in Southeast Asia, visiting Hong Kong, living in Japan in the late 70s. And in the early 80s, I ended up living in Hong Kong and um, began to understand what journalism was via a job I fell into with the BBC as a sound recordist. So, it wasn't through photography that I learned about journalism. It was through television news gathering. And that prepared me to have a magazine career. So, um, I wanted to make a living as a photographer, and living in Hong Kong at that time, as you say, a really pivotal kind of um, fundamental moment in the years before the handover in 1997. And timing is something you can't predict. So that was a very interesting and vital time to be living there, and lucky timing for me to figure out how to start making a living as a magazine photographer. So the magazine photography, the work as a photojournalist, lasted, maybe almost 20 years, but at some point I decided to turn my back on that, because it started diverging with my own interests. And I wanted to go back to making, let's call it pictures for myself, or pictures that didn't have the same objectives as a magazine story or magazine photography might. Um, Pictures for magazines tend to be very to the point and very illustrative of someone's story, someone else's story, let's call it. And I wanted to go back to kind of my earliest impulses in making pictures that maybe didn't have obvious answers, that were kind of autonomous, let's call it. So I ended up turning my back on the magazines basically when I was living in Shanghai, and wanting to make longer term projects that might become books, or I didn't know what exactly. So even though the magazine years in many ways were a kind of dream come true, getting to work for Time and Newsweek and later National Geographic, at some point it kind of played itself out. And I went back to that early impulse of just making pictures for myself without knowing exactly what it was for.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer because I can photography, that is always the trick, isn't it? I mean, you definitely need to make a living to buy my equipment, do what I love to do, right? But yeah, you at some point you have to tell yourself and say to yourself, it's like, is this what I really want to do? And is this telling my story? And I can see that it has contributed a lot of what you did do in gathering those images have contributed to you as a image maker, which is just incredible, and I really appreciated that. But let's look at that. So your love of photography started early when you were a teen, as you had talked about, and I had read. Um, Looking over your life, what were those pinnacle moments that directed you into your career trajectory?
Some luck, some timing, some help, and my break that allowed me to become a photographer, a working photographer, making a living photographing for magazines. I mean, that came in 1987. I was on holidays from the BBC, where I was working as a sound reporters, and I went to Sri Lanka. I had um, the time to spend some time just going off to do a story, basically. And I discovered what a story means by working in television. And that was my kind of on-the-job training in terms of what a story was in journalistic terms. So I had some time. I went to Sri Lanka, and I got a letter from a magazine in Hong Kong, a letter of introduction, something I could show to the authorities in Sri Lanka to get press credentials to operate in the country. But, I contacted the local stringer there and asked him the best way to do what I needed to do, which was to basically get on an Army helicopter. And he gave me the phone number of the Minister of Defense, who only answers his telephone at 5:30 in the morning in his
Oh,
taking his morning bath. And so I called that number 5:30 in the morning. He answered the phone, and I explained who I was and what I wanted to do. And so he told me to be at the military airport the next morning, asked for Major so-and-so, and got onto a helicopter and was able to get some, fairly tough pictures of the fighting that was going on in the north of the country. Came back with a strong set of pictures, and the magazine published them and then offered me the job. So that was my break, but it happened through, access through introductions from a local journalist, a telephone number scrawled on a hotel bar napkin. Um, just certain things fell into place that allowed that step for me to happen. Had that not happened, I don't know what other thing might have happened later, but that was the pivotal thing that kind of launched me into my magazine career. And so I was offered a job, went at that with everything I had, and, thrilled to be making a living finally as a working photographer. Happily abandoned making pictures for myself in favor of doing things for magazines. And I didn't feel compromised, in the least in these early days. Quite the contrary, I was doing exactly what I wanted to do. But over the years, that did play out. So after 20 years, you can say it started diverging, and I wanted to do other things in another way that magazines couldn't use, a kind of picture that was maybe a longer term kind of thing, rather than illustrated on an eternal story. So in any case, I had my break in 1987 and got offered a job. I worked for a year, and the compromise in that sense when you're employed is that the magazine or your employer owns the copyright to the pictures. And that was a kind of a sacrifice in order to get a portfolio of published work that I could show to other magazines like Time and Newsweek or whatever. And then I started freelancing, and when you're a freelance photographer, of course, you run your own pictures, and that was an important thing for me. I knew I needed to own my own pictures.
yeah. Yeah, and that is the advantage of going freelance, is that idea of that copyright portion that you spoke about is now in your hands. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting to me. But what it was even more fascinating with your story there, and I love to hear it. It was like it sounded like one of the films I used to watch when I was younger. It'd be like, a little number scrolled on a cocktail napkin at the bar, and like you got a call. And it's like, wow,
Mhm.
that could be a movie. I mean, my gosh.